Hello and welcome to the Heaven Bound Sunday School class at the First General Baptist Church in Truman. We're going to read some scripture from the 21st chapter of Revelation. Now we all know that the Apostle John was the author of Revelation. He wrote it while in exile on the Isle of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. Now while there he saw a vision from God, and one of those visions was about the new city, the New Jerusalem. Now, throughout history, God's people have held firmly to the truth that God will provide for his people at the end of time. These visions, while not necessarily depicting a physical location, nevertheless point to God's faithfulness to his people. Now, we'll read from Revelation 21, beginning in verse 10. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as a crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The angel who talked with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates, and its walls. The city was laid out like a square, as long as it was wide. He measured the city with the rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length, and as wide and high as it is long. The angel measured the wall using human measurement, and it was 144 cubits thick. The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. The foundations of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth ruby, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th turquoise, the 11th hyacinth, and the 12th amethyst. The 12 gates were 12 pearls, with each gate made of a single pearl. The great street of the city was of gold, as pure as transparent glass. Now, as John was being carried away in the Spirit, he was carried to a mountain that is described as both great and high. And while there on this mountain, he saw the holy city. It says it was coming out of heaven, and it was coming from God. Now, God's glory lit up the city. No need for any artificial light, no need for any natural light, the light coming simply from the glory of God. It describes it as being like a very precious jewel, says it was clear as crystal. Now, the clear light is described as jasper in the scripture, but the jasper we know is more of an opaque stone. The reference may be more like the crystal clear brilliance of a perfect diamond. There is uncertainty about the identification of precious stones and antiquity. The brilliant light of the city, no matter what it is compared with, comes from the presence of God. John talks about seeing high walls, and all these walls had 12 gates, and there was 12 angels at each gate. And the names of the 12 tribes of Israel were written on the gates. The high and great wall illustrates God's glory and God's purity. Now, we talked about there's 12 gates. There's 4 walls, 3 gates on each wall. A typical city of that time that was walled, and most of them were, they had 1 gate, which was to get in the city and to get out of the city. At night, the gate was always closed to keep intruders out. Well, this new city, the New Jerusalem, got 12 gates. There's none of the gates are there to keep people out. It's very open, very welcoming, and there for everyone. Now, as opposed to a singular city gate open for certain times, the multiple gates of New Jerusalem never close. All the people of God from all parts of the earth are invited to enter the New Jerusalem. Individuals from every nation, every tribe, every language will worship God in this new city. Now, it also talks about the city having 12 foundations, and those foundations all signify the 12 apostles. Now, during this vision, while they're up seeing the new city, the angel, it says, had a rod of gold, and he was using that for John's purposes to measure the city, measure the gates, measure the walls. Turns out the city was long as it was wide, and it measured 12 stadia, and that translates into anywhere between 1,300 to 1,500 miles, and the length, the width, and the height all identical. It says the walls were 144 cubits thick, which is not very thick. It was not meant to exclude God's people. The walls made of jasper. We talked about jasper earlier, and it says God's presence radiates throughout the city. The city, gold, pure as glass, more refined than human hands can produce. It also tells us that the foundations, the 12 foundations we talked about earlier, decorated with precious stones. And we'll just name a few of them: sapphire, emerald, onyx, ruby, topaz, and many more. Now the gates were made of pearls, the streets made of gold, the new city, the New Jerusalem. Now the Apostle John used vivid language to describe a glorious and splendid heavenly city. Unlike earthly cities, the heavenly city glows with the brightness of God's glory. God's glory shines throughout the city, more vivid and illuminating than sunlight. Our hope as believers is that we will someday worship God in that beautiful heavenly city. There will be no place like it.